Take a slow breath before we begin, not to relax, but to make space. Because what you're about to hear is not a heroic legend, and it's not a clean story with a comforting ending. It's the kind of history that stays quiet for a long time until it suddenly refuses to. Have you ever noticed how certain places feel heavier than others? Not haunted in the way movies exaggerate, but burdened, like the ground itself is holding something back. In 1875, in the sugar-growing interior of Pernambuco, Brazil, there was a plantation where people avoided drawing water from one particular well, not because the water tasted bad, not because it was dry, but because everyone knew what had happened there, even if no one dared say it out loud. This story begins there, not with a name in a document, but with a boy whose age was never written down. He was small enough that the iron around his ankles still looked oversized, old enough to understand punishment, too young to understand mercy. If you're listening from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia, it's tempting to imagine slavery as something distant, a closed chapter, neatly archived. But in 19th century Brazil, slavery was not a memory. It was daily life. Brazil would not abolish it until 1888, later than almost anywhere else in the Western world. And on plantations like this one, discipline wasn't enforced by law alone. It was enforced by fear, public fear. The well was part of that system. It wasn't just for water. It was a punishment site, a vertical shaft carved into the earth, lined with stone, dark even at noon. Enslaved people who resisted, spoke back, or simply slowed down from exhaustion were lowered into it, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. The air was damp, the walls were slick, and the message was clear. The plantation owned not just your labor, but your body, your breath, your survival. The boy had been lowered into that well before, more than once. No one recorded why. Records rarely bothered with reasons when the victim was enslaved. But witnesses later said he cried silently, not screaming, not begging, just staring upward, counting the seconds between footsteps. The overseer, the fighter, was the one who decided when a rope went down and when it came back up. He was known for being methodical, not violent in a chaotic way, violent in a bureaucratic way, punishment as procedure, cruelty with a schedule. People like him rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as necessary. On the morning it happened, the air was thick. Pernambuco's dry heat presses down differently, not like a wave, but like a hand that doesn't let go. The plantation was already awake. Sugarcane leaves sliced the wind. Tools struck earth. No one expected anything unusual. The boy had been accused of wasting water. It sounds absurd now, but on plantations, absurd accusations were useful. They reminded everyone that survival itself could be treated as disobedience. The overseer ordered him to the well. No shouting, no spectacle, just routine. But something had shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the accumulation of nights in darkness. Maybe it was a quiet realization that this well, this hole, was meant to teach him that he could be erased at any moment. As the rope lowered him again, witnesses noticed something strange. He wasn't crying. He wasn't resisting. He was watching the hands, watching the knot, watching the man who leaned over the stone edge, confident, bored, certain. And this is where the story becomes difficult, not because of what the boy did, but because of what it forces us to confront. At some point, the overseer leaned too far. Accounts differ on whether the rope slipped or whether the boy pulled. History often fractures at moments like this, leaving only fragments behind. But everyone agreed on one thing. There was a sound, a sudden, sharp interruption, like air being punched out of the day. The overseer lost his balance and fell into the well. Not slowly, not ceremonially. He vanished. The rope snapped loose. The stone walls swallowed him whole. And for a moment, the plantation froze, suspended between disbelief and terror. No one moved. No one shouted. Because in systems built on fear, silence is survival. The boy was still there, in the well, alive. Imagine that moment. Put yourself there, not as a judge, not as a historian, but as a human being listening to the echo of a body hitting water far below. The splash wasn't loud. Wells absorb sound. What rose instead was a silence, so dense it felt intentional. When the overseer didn't resurface, panic spread. Not because of compassion, but because hierarchy had been breached. An enslaved child had outlived a man who represented authority. That was intolerable. The boy was pulled out first. His hands were shaking, but his face was empty. No triumph, no horror, just the stillness of someone whose body has already processed something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. They searched the well. The overseer was dead, drowned, and suddenly, the plantation had a problem it didn't know how to solve. Because if the law intervened too harshly, it would expose a punishment system it pretended didn't exist. And if it did nothing, it risked something even worse, an idea spreading. The idea that power could slip, that gravity didn't respect titles, that even a child could survive the fall meant to erase him. And that idea was dangerous. In the next block, we'll follow what happened after the well went quiet, how the plantation responded, how the courts twisted language to protect authority, and how a boy without a recorded age became a whispered warning across Pernambuco. But for now, sit with this. The well didn't choose sides. It just obeyed gravity. And sometimes, gravity tells the truth long before people do. Before we move forward, I want you to do something uncomfortable, but honest. Picture a courtroom. Not the cinematic kind with polished wood and clear rules. Picture a room where the outcome is decided before anyone speaks, and the law is just a costume it wears. That's the world this boy was dragged into after the well. News didn't travel like it does now, but it still traveled fast when it served power. A dead overseer was not just a tragedy on plantation. It was a threat to every plantation, because overseers were the hands of the system. If the hands could be broken, people would start imagining the body could fall too. So the plantation owner acted quickly, not out of grief, out of containment. Witnesses were organized. Statements were shaped. The story was trimmed down to one essential message. This was not a consequence of cruelty. This was an act of criminal defiance. And the boy, a child, was labeled with the most dangerous word authorities could assign to an enslaved person, murderer. But here's the thing that rarely gets said plainly. If you imprison a child in a punishment well, if you lower him into darkness to teach him obedience, and you do it again and again, what do you think you're creating? A monster or a survivor who finally stops believing you'll ever spare him? The authorities didn't ask that question. They couldn't afford to, because the moment they acknowledged the well as a punishment device, they would be forced to admit the plantation was operating like a private prison, outside public oversight, outside morality, and often outside even the written law. So they did what oppressive systems do best. They changed the subject. The trial, such as it was, revolved around the overseer's death, not the overseer's methods. The man who was known for lowering people into the earth became, in legal language, a victim of savage intent. And the child became an idea they needed to crush. What makes this case especially chilling is how the boy was described. Not as a person with a mind, not as a child with fear, but as something closer to a tool that had malfunctioned. A local clerk wrote, later cited by others, that the boy showed coldness, emptiness, lack of remorse. Those words appear again and again in historical violence. The oppressor describing trauma as evil, because evil is easier to punish than trauma. No one asked what his nights were like. No one asked how many times he'd been lowered into the well. No one asked what it does to a child's body to breathe damp air and hear nothing but his own heartbeat echoing off stone. Instead, the questions were engineered to prove something predetermined. Did he pull the rope? Did he grab the overseer? Did he lure him close? Was it planned? Planned. Listen to that word. Planned. As if an enslaved child, living under constant surveillance, could plan in the way free people imagine planning. With choices, with safe time, with privacy. And yet, witnesses were pressured to say the boy looked alert before being lowered, that he watched carefully, that he waited. The court needed intention, because intention meant guilt, and guilt meant a warning to others. Because here's what they feared more than the death itself. If the boy's act could be interpreted as an accident, a slip, a moment of imbalance, then the blame would drift upward toward the system that created the moment. but if it could be interpreted as deliberate, then the blame could be sealed inside the child like a stone dropped into a river. And rivers, like courts, can hide what they swallow. There were whispers outside the courtroom, not in newspapers. Most enslaved people couldn't access them, and many papers were aligned with elites. The whispers traveled through kitchens, through cane rows, through churchyards, through places where people shared water and warnings. They said the boy didn't scream when they accused him. They said he stared at the floor, as if listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. They said when the judge asked him why it happened, he didn't answer, not because he couldn't, but because no answer would be accepted. And then something even darker surfaced. Some said the plantation owner didn't want a public trial at all. The rumor was that he pushed for a private resolution, a punishment handled internally, that the courts were involved only because an overseer's family demanded recognition, demanded performance of justice. Whether that's fully true or not, the pattern is documented across many slave societies. When violence happens to enslaved people, it's discipline. When violence happens to the enforcers, it's crime. A double language, two worlds. One law for those considered human, another for those treated as property. So what happened to the boy? The record becomes foggy here, and that fog is not accidental. There are names missing, ages missing, details conveniently blurred. But several accounts converge on a grim outcome. The boy was not treated as a child. He was treated as a threat. Some say he was sentenced to harsh public punishment, the kind designed to break a body in front of others, to rewrite fear into the community. Others say he was transferred, sold quietly to another region, disappearing into a different plantation system, like a candle snuffed out and replaced. And then there's a version that became a legend, that the boy was returned to the plantation, that he was forced to stand near the well, and that the well, now avoided, now infamous, became his shadow for the rest of his life, as if the system wanted him to live beside the site of his crime until it swallowed him too. Whatever the exact legal outcome, the social outcome is clearer. The plantation changed its routines. Overseers stopped leaning so far over the stone edge. The rope knots were checked twice. Punishment became more guarded, more paranoid, not more humane, just more careful. And if you think about it, that detail says everything. Because after the overseer drowned, the system didn't ask, how do we stop children from reaching this point? It asked, how do we prevent this from happening again? Not by removing cruelty, but by reducing the risk to cruelty's agents. Now, hold this image in your mind. A well in Pernambuco, a child pulled from darkness, a courtroom using language like a blade, and a society so committed to order that it treats a broken child as a criminal, while treating the broken system as normal. In the next block, we'll move beyond the courtroom into what people carried in secret, the rumors, the spiritual interpretations, the plantation superstitions, and the way this story began to mutate into something even larger than the boy himself. Because once a story like this enters the air, it doesn't stay a story. It becomes a warning, a symbol, a spark, and sparks, in dry places, don't need permission to spread. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, and don't answer it quickly. Have you ever noticed how official records end, but stories don't? Courts close files. Plantations change routines. Names fade from paper. But memory has its own routes. It travels through fear, through whispers, through places people avoid without fully knowing why. That's what happened after the trial. The well didn't disappear. It stayed where it was, stone rim warm under the sun, shadow deep inside, but it changed status. It was no longer just a tool. It became a reference point. People began to lower their voices near it, not because they believed the overseer's spirit haunted it in some theatrical sense. This wasn't about ghosts rattling chains. It was about something more unsettling, the sense that the ground itself had witnessed a truth the authorities wanted buried. On plantations across Pernambuco, people talked. Quietly, they said the well remembered. They said water drawn from it tasted metallic. Even when it didn't. They said animals refused to drink from a bucket. They said overseers avoided leaning over it, even years later, as if gravity there felt impatient. And always, the story came back to boy, not as a name, because names are dangerous when you're enslaved. but as a figure. Some said he never spoke again. Some said he laughed at the wrong moments. Some said he grew into a man who carried silence like a second spine. Others said he didn't last long, that punishment followed punishment, and the system finished what it started. What matters is not which version is true in a forensic sense. What matters is that the story fractured, and in fracturing, it spread. In the corridors where enslaved people slept, the well became a lesson whispered to children at night. Not encouragement, not instruction, a warning. They didn't say, do this. They said, this is what happens when the ground stops cooperating. And that distinction matters, because enslaved communities had always shared stories, but usually ones about escape, trickery, survival. This one was different. It wasn't about cleverness. It wasn't about planning. It was about a moment when cruelty miscalculated. And miscalculation terrified those who depended on predictability. Plantation owners didn't talk about it openly, but their behavior changed. Punishment wells were covered, disguised, or quietly abandoned in some regions, not out of compassion, but because symbolism is dangerous. A whip is obvious. A chain is clear. But a well that has already swallowed authority, that becomes an idea. And ideas are harder to supervise. Local priests, caught between doctrine and reality, try to reinterpret the story. Some preach that the overseer's death was divine judgment, not for cruelty, but for excess. Others twisted it further, suggesting the boy had been possessed by something unnatural. That version served a purpose. If the act could be framed as spiritual corruption, then it didn't need to be examined as human reaction. Evil spirits are easier to condemn than human systems. But among the enslaved, the interpretation was quieter and sharper. They said the well did what people were too afraid to do. They said the earth had weight, that it always pulls downward, and that someday everyone leans too far. This wasn't rebellion rhetoric. It was something older, something closer to inevitability. And inevitability is frightening to power, because power survives by pretending it's permanent. Even after the boy disappeared from records, the well stayed present in memory. Parents warned children away from it, not because it was cursed, but because it had already been used to teach too many lessons. Ironically, that made it sacred, not holy. Sacred in the sense that pain had marked it, and places marked by pain don't empty easily. Years later, travelers passing through the region recorded strange notes in journals. Nothing dramatic, just observations. That certain wells were avoided. That plantation workers fell silent near specific sites. That no one would explain why. Silence was the explanation. If you're listening now and wondering why the story survived at all, why it wasn't completely erased, the answer is simple and unsettling. Because it frightened the people who benefited from forgetting. The overseer's death wasn't a danger. The danger was that it revealed something the system worked tirelessly to deny. That control depends on cooperation. That even terror has limits. That when you push a body far enough, it stops responding the way you expect. And once that truth leaks out, it doesn't matter how many trials you stage. The ground already knows. In the final block, we'll step back from the well and look at the wider aftermath. How stories like this fit into the final decades of Brazilian slavery, how fear began to shift sides, and why abolition didn't arrive as a clean moral awakening, but as a reluctant concession to a system cracking under its own weight. And when we close this story, we won't ask whether the boy was right or wrong. We'll ask a harder question. What kind of world creates a child who survives by letting gravity finish a lesson adults refuse to learn? Stay with me a little longer, not because this part is easier, but because this is where the meaning sharpens. By the mid-1870s, Brazil was already cracking. On paper, the empire still stood tall. Sugar, coffee, and land fed wealth upward. Laws spoke the language of order. But underneath that surface, pressure was building, not in speeches or reforms, but in exhausted bodies and quiet calculations. Pernambuco felt it early. Plantations were struggling to maintain the old rhythm. International pressure was growing. Britain had forced the end of the transatlantic trade decades earlier. Enslaved people were no longer replaceable in the way owners had once assumed. Every body lost was a financial loss. And fear, real fear, began to change direction. Before, fear flowed downward, from owners to overseers, from overseers to the enslaved, from whip to skin. But stories like the well disrupted that flow. Because once people realized that cruelty carried risk, not moral risk, but practical risk, behavior shifted. Overseers became cautious. Punishments became less theatrical. Violence moved out of sight. Again, not kinder, just quieter. This is how systems decay, not with collapse, but with adjustment. And that's why the story of the boy didn't spark open revolt. It did something more corrosive. It planted doubt in the certainty of control, doubt in the idea that obedience could always be extracted, doubt in the belief that terror was infinite. Owners began writing letters to one another about discipline failures. Manuals shifted language, advising restraint not for ethical reasons, but to avoid incidents. Think about that phrase, avoid incidents. Not avoid cruelty, not avoid harm, just avoid consequences. Meanwhile, among enslaved communities, the meaning of the story matured. It stopped being about the overseer. It stopped being about the well. It became about limits. People began to understand, quietly, cautiously, that even the most brutal system depends on predictability, and unpredictability is its weakness. This didn't lead to reckless defiance. It led to something far more dangerous: strategic endurance, slower work, collective silence, moments of refusal disguised as exhaustion, and occasionally, when pushed too far, moments where the system broke its own teeth. By the time abolition finally arrived in 1888, it wasn't because Brazil had suddenly discovered compassion. It was because slavery had become unstable, too expensive, too dangerous, too full of small fractures like the one that opened beside that well. And here's the uncomfortable truth many histories avoid. Abolition did not arrive as justice. It arrived as damage control. The boy from the well didn't live to see it. Most likely, he didn't live long at all. The system was not forgiving the children who embarrassed it, but his story outlived him, not because it was celebrated, but because it was useful. It reminded people that force has weight limits, that gravity doesn't negotiate, that eventually, someone always leans too far. So when you hear stories like this, when you feel the discomfort they carry, resist the urge to categorize them neatly. This is not a tale of heroism. It's not a parable of vengeance. It's a record of what happens when a child is pushed past the point where fear works. And if there's a lesson here, one that crosses centuries and borders, it's this: systems that rely on cruelty don't collapse when people become brave. They collapse when cruelty stops producing obedience. They collapse when the ground stops cooperating. And sometimes all it takes is one moment, one miscalculation, for the truth to surface from a place everyone pretended was just a... Before we end, I want you to slow down again. Not because the story needs drama, but because meaning only lands when we let it. Stories like this one don't survive because they're neat. They survive because they refuse to be resolved. The boy never became a symbol in official history. There are no statues, no plaques, no school lessons built around his name. If he even had one that survived ink and fire. But absence is also a form of presence. Because when a system works as hard to erase a child, it's not erasing weakness, it's erasing exposure. What happened at that well forced something into the open that slavery depended on keeping hidden. The illusion of total control. The overseer believed gravity obeyed him. The plantation believed fear was permanent. The law believed language could seal reality shut. All three were wrong. And this is where the story stops being about 1875. Because every system built on domination eventually teaches the same lesson, not to the oppressed, but to itself. That control is conditional. That bodies have breaking points. That silence can turn into pressure. The boy didn't overthrow slavery. He didn't inspire a movement. He didn't even escape. But he exposed a crack. And cracks matter. They're how light gets in, not the poetic kind, but the destabilizing kind. The kind that forces power to look down and realize the ground isn't infinite. Think about how this story makes you feel. Uncomfortable? Good. If it felt easy, it would mean you'd turn it into entertainment. And this was never meant to entertain. This is history doing what it's supposed to do, interrupting comfort. The well in Pernambuco, eventually collapsed. Stones shift, water erodes, plantations fall apart. The land forgets names, but not weight. And that's the part that lingers. Not the overseer's authority, not the court's language, not even the plantation's wealth. What lingers is a reminder that when you build a world that depends on pushing children into darkness to function, you're already standing on borrowed ground. So when you leave the story, when you carry it into your own time, your own country, your own assumptions, don't ask whether the boy was guilty. Ask something harder. What systems around us still rely on fear working forever? What punishments are disguised as routine? What wells do we pretend are just infrastructure? Because history doesn't repeat itself neatly. It rhymes quietly. And sometimes, the most honest verdict isn't delivered by a court. It's delivered by gravity. When someone leans too far, and the ground finally answers.